What traits are most important for us to develop on our journey along the Buddhist path? What traits are most helpful to us in becoming better people and becoming wiser and kinder and calmer? This is the issue I'm going to deal with in today's video, where we're going to discuss these 5 spiritual faculties. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. The question here that we're going to deal with in today's video is about trying to find what these faculties are and what they mean for us. There are certain ideas, certain faculties, certain mental properties that we have that are particularly useful to us in our path of practice. And in order to illuminate what it would mean for us to have such faculties, I think it can help to consider, at least for a moment, the case of a contrasting philosophical point of view, which we find in ancient Greece. Arguably the closest ethical system that we find in the world to Buddhism is the ethical system that we find in ancient Greece, or one of them, called virtue ethics. And virtue ethics, I consider Buddhism in general to be an ethical system, a system of trying to find the best way to live in the world. And in ancient Greece, they were particularly interested in that kind of question, how we live the best kind of life. One of the questions we deal with in ethics is what is right and what is wrong? Many ethical systems base that kind of approach on an idea of trying to decide which actions we should do and which actions we should avoid doing, splitting up the world into good actions and bad actions. However, virtue ethics is different. Virtue ethics isn't so much interested in which actions we should do, although that can be useful to us in a sort of a secondary way, but rather interested more in which virtues we should look to improve in our lives, how to become better people, which properties, which aspects of our mind are really helpful to us. And when we decide which those are, then coming up with practices that can help reinforce those abilities, those psychological characteristics that we have that are so useful. Now, in ancient Greece, they spent a lot of time trying to figure out which the virtues were, and not so much time on figuring out the practices. Whereas in Buddhism, it's somewhat the reverse. There are several potential lists of what we might call virtues that we should improve in Buddhism, but they didn't really spend much time figuring out which the list was. The one that I'm going to be discussing today might be considered the best of these. We'll get to that in a moment. But in Buddhism, of course, they spent much more time interested in the practices. What exact practices should we use to improve these virtues? And in fact, this list that I'll be discussing today is one that is really of central importance, and yet I haven't discussed yet in any of my videos. And that is this list of the 5 what are called spiritual faculties. Now, it's translated in English as spiritual faculties, but it's really only one word. The word is indriyas. And the word indriya comes from the chief of the Vedic gods, Indra. It's not really referring directly to Indra. It's not saying these are Indras or something like that, but what it's saying is that they display something of Indra's characteristics in being sort of the controlling faculties, the controlling abilities that we have, the most dominant or important ones. And so in this sense, these are particularly dominant and important for us in our practice along the path, as we'll see. And one recent, very good Buddhist scholar, Edward Conze, has labeled these faculties the 5 cardinal virtues of Buddhism. And a man who is perhaps the leading, or one of the leading experts on early Buddhist philosophy, Rupert Gethin, had this to say about them. He says, "They represent in general what it is that the bhikkhu, that is the monastic, is aiming to cultivate. Indeed, it's hardly an exaggeration to say that every sutta concerns their treatment in one way or another." So while we could translate indriyas as simply virtues or faculties, they aren't generally virtues or faculties, but they're they're virtues or faculties that are particularly useful to us in our path of practice, in our path towards enlightenment, towards nirvana. And that's the reason why this is often translated as the spiritual faculties. Now, having said that, what are they? There are 5 of them. These are either confidence or faith, depending on how we translate that term. Let's say confidence, strength, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. These are the 5 spiritual faculties that are very important to us. Now, what I want to do in the rest of this video is to go through these 5 and discuss why they're important and how they're important. And then, once we've done that, we'll have some discussion about what our attitude should be to them. And then at the end, we'll discuss a little bit about to whom they might apply, to whom these virtues might really apply. So to begin with, let's take confidence. Confidence, otherwise translated, it's a concept translated either faith or confidence. I prefer the translation confidence because I think that captures better what we find in early Buddhism. Without confidence, we're not going to enter into any path of practice. We need confidence in that path. We need some understanding of what the path is, of why we should undertake it, of what it entails, in order to get started, and indeed in order to continue on that path. Confidence is our ability, our virtue that overcomes doubt, that gets us through our doubts. Because doubts, of course, can trip us up. If we doubt what we're doing, we're not going to proceed properly. In fact, we're probably not going to proceed at all. Now, how can we practice in a way to increase our confidence? How can we even engender confidence where it doesn't exist? Well, there are many passages in early Buddhism that discuss this, but the general idea is that the Dharma is the fuel for confidence. Hearing the Dharma, considering the Dharma, discussing it, discussing our questions and concerns, our doubts even. This is the way that we come to confidence in the path. It's the way we come to confidence in what we're doing. Now, this isn't to say that we understand everything, far from it. We'll be moving forward slowly, bit by bit, and when we begin, we're going to have confidence in only that small amount that we really know and understand, but that can be enough. However, confidence isn't enough on its own. In other words, it's enough to have confidence in a small thing, so long as we have other virtues as well in the background pushing us on and helping us. And so we need these other virtues. We need not only in a sense do we need all of them, but it's important that we need the next one, which is strength. Now, strength or energy or persistence, depending on how we translate this term, is basically our ability to overcome our ordinary tendency for laziness, for procrastination, putting things off, not wanting to do things. We need energy, we need persistence to push through the problems. It's great to have confidence, but if we don't have energy or persistence, that confidence isn't going to be realized in actual practice. We're going to put things off, as we know. This is a way of understanding that we need to put effort into, I should say, what is it we need to put effort into? We need to put effort into what is beneficial. We need to put effort into skillful views, into skillful action, skillful speech, skillful livelihood. We need to put effort into abandoning or decreasing our tendency for unskillful actions, for unskillful speech, unskillful livelihood, unskillful thoughts. That's the kind of effort we need to put in. Indeed, this kind of strength is, in one passage in the early texts, essentially identified with right effort, which is, as we will know, one of the stages on the Eightfold Path. One of the stages is this right effort, where you make these 4 kinds of effort to increase what's positive in us, to make it so that more positive things will happen in the future in our minds. In other words, lay the groundwork for positivity in the future, to abandon what's unskillful right now, and to make our minds such that the unskillful things won't arise in the future. These are the ways that the energy can be helpful for us as we move forward. The third of these virtues is mindfulness. And this is a virtue that helps us to overcome heedlessness, overcome forgetfulness, which I think we all know about a lot in our lives. Mindfulness is the best way for us to see directly the difference between skillful and unskillful action. As we see it in the moment, we see that unskillful reaching fruition right now, we've done something bad, we can see it immediately, or we've done something good and we can see it immediately. We also can sit with actions we've done in the recent past or long ago and see how those sit with us in a mindful sense. And we can, reflecting back on them, determine for ourselves whether they were truly skillful or unskillful. This is one of the benefits of a mindful approach to life. One of the things that we do in mindfulness is to pay attention to our bodies, to our minds. Indeed, the proper practice of mindfulness is following the four foundations of mindfulness, which are mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, that is, pleasant and unpleasant, paying attention to that difference when we're feeling things that are pleasant, when we're feeling things that are unpleasant. A mindfulness of mind, that is to say, to keep an eye on the character of our mind, whether it's in a beneficial kind of character or not, and what we make of that and how we can perhaps act in such ways as to make the beneficial kinds of mind come up more often. And finally, mindfulness of dharmas, which is to say, to keep an eye on how we're doing along the path, to keep an eye on the character of our mind when we think of our mind as the main factor towards awakening. This is sort of how we practice mindfulness in a very small nutshell. There's another aspect, however, that's discussed in the early suttas about this virtue of mindfulness. It says that one who has the faculty of mindfulness is one who remembers and recollects what was done and said long ago. And here I think we maybe put in mind of the aphorism by George Santayana that those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I think we can all think of examples in contemporary life, in contemporary politics, the contemporary world, or even in our own lives, ways in which forgetting the past has been very detrimental, in which forgetting the lessons of the past has ended up hurting a lot of people, or hurting ourselves or those close to us. And so, keeping in mind is being mindful. Keeping the past in mind is being mindful. That's indeed one of the main characteristics, the main functions of this virtue that we have, is retaining in mind our own past as a source of information to us right now about the right ways and wrong ways we should be proceeding. The fourth of these virtues is the virtue of concentration, which overcomes our ordinary tendency to have a scattered mind. The idea of concentration is that we have this virtue of being able to have a one-pointed mind, of being able to concentrate or focus our efforts on a particular topic and hold that topic in our mind without the mind being drawn this way and that by other things, by being distracted and so on. And it's through this virtue that we can gain true clarity into what it is we're trying to discern. If we don't have this kind of virtue, then we're not going to have the kind of clarity we need to make real progress. We're going to be drawn this way and that. We're going to be distracted. We're going to think we have achieved something and then be pulled away again. And so this virtue is one that is really important for us to begin to see where we are in our lives, where we are in our practice, see clearly, see deeply. As it goes on, as we go deeper into the practice, this virtue of concentration will then be resolved in what's known as the jhanic states, the states of jhana. And these are states of deep absorptive meditation of one kind and another. There's 4 of them. I'm not going to go into them all today. I've discussed them on other videos. And for many of us, they will not really be the focus of our efforts because it takes a long time of deep meditation to achieve them. However, they can be a great source of solace, of happiness, of pleasure, if that's something that we want to achieve. The fifth virtue is the virtue of wisdom. And this is known as, or is claimed to be, basically the chief virtue when it comes to attaining enlightenment, the most important. This is the virtue that overcomes delusion, that overcomes ignorance. It's the virtue that sees the arising and passing of things, that sees things clearly, the arising and passing of all phenomena, that sees the interdependence of all things, the way that an action that we take now has ramifications in the future, or a particular positive state that we have now, or a particular view or belief we have now, ramifies into further actions in the future, positive or negative, depending on the case. It sees suffering. It sees the unsatisfactory nature of reality. It sees the reason for this suffering. It sees the reason why reality seems unsatisfactory. It also sees that there's a way around that. There's a way to deal with the problem such that the suffering will evaporate. And it sees that there are techniques, practices that we can use to realize that ending of suffering. That is to say that this faculty we have of wisdom is a faculty that sees the Four Noble Truths. It's a faculty that understands them. That is, we have a natural faculty for seeing the world as it is. Now, ordinarily in us, it's not very well developed. I think we all know this. I certainly know it in myself. It's not very well developed. But there are practices we can use to develop this faculty of wisdom. And indeed, these are just the practices that we know from our Buddhist practice. Things like mindfulness practice and so on. Now, having listed these five, secondly, what should our view be of them? How should we approach them? How should we hold them? And there are a couple of suttas that are quite interesting in this regard. Now, one of them says that it's important to know the gratification, the danger, and the escape from all five of these virtues, from all five of these faculties. The gratification, what does that mean? That means the positive factors of them, the positive features of them. How are they useful to us? How are they good? How are they beneficial? How do they make us feel good? But the dangers, what are the dangers in each of them? What is the escape from those dangers? And we might wonder what the dangers would be in things like mindfulness and things like wisdom and things like concentration and confidence and so on. And I'll leave a lot of that up to you. It's something that you might want to meditate upon, but I'll give you an idea. One danger may be clinging to them, that we may cling to them too much. A second sutta that we find has a similar kind of message. It says that it's important to know the arising and the cessation of each of these five factors. It's not enough simply to know the factors. We must know their arising, their cessation, and the road leading to their cessation. Again, why are these important? Because if we think of them as the be-all and end-all of practice to develop these factors, we're going to want to cling to them. We're going to want to hold them as mine, as who I am, as who I really am and want to be. So what's interesting here is, as opposed to the idea in, let's say, ancient Greece, where development of these virtues is really the entire path and the entire point of ethics, here these virtues are, of course, key. They're exceedingly important, but they're not the end of our efforts. They're not the end of the path. Now, it's clear that all of these arise due to skillful attention, due to wholesome attention that we put to them, due to wholesome and skillful effort. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem, as I say, is that all of that wholesome effort and attention has a certain kind of residue of egoism behind it, a residue of, we might say, conceit, that is, this kind of comparing mind, thinking of ourselves as better than others or worse than others, perhaps. We haven't achieved something. And all of this efforting that may be involved in the bolstering of these 5 factors, these 5 virtues, is problematic in a way. It can lead to subtle states of clinging, subtle states of identification. And insofar as it does, we're not going to be truly completing the path. Another way to put that is that we may cling to our wisdom as being very advanced, let's say. If we do that, then we know that our wisdom is not completely advanced, because insofar as we're clinging to that wisdom as being exceptional or as being important or whatever, we're displaying some, at least, subtle level of ignorance, of unskillful tendencies within ourselves. And there are also dangers in all of these, in our opinions about them in others. We may look at other people who we believe display these virtues, and we may cling to them. We may cling to them as somehow our savior, as somehow somebody who's going to help pull us out of where we are, without our own effort in being involved, perhaps. We may also look at them with jealousy and say, why do they have these virtues and I don't? Perhaps we may say, I've practiced longer than they have, or I've read more books than they have, or something like that. There's all kinds of ways that conceit can get threaded into here as we're practicing with these 5 virtues. So it's important for us, when we come to understand these, to understand them, but to understand their dangers, to understand their cessation as well, not to become too attached to them when we find them in ourselves, or too angry about them when we don't, let's say. Now, the third question I want to ask here is, when are these virtues really found? Where and when, and in whom? And there seems to be something of a difference here, or at least a little bit of a controversy. Rupert Gethin, who is a major, one of the leading scholars of early Buddhism, has noted that in the early texts, these 5 seem to be relatively advanced, in the sense that we only seem to find them, at least in certain texts, it suggests that they're only found perhaps in people who are well along on the path, people who are what are called stream enterers, that is, that have overcome doubts, that no longer have doubts about the path, who have seen the end of the path for themselves, although they're not awakened. And so that seems to be the picture we find in early Buddhism, but in the commentarial tradition, which arose later, there seems a little bit of a broader understanding of these virtues. They're understood to be virtues or faculties that are held by many, many people who aren't far along on the path, and that simply they're things that sort of are the common heritage of all of us, and it's just that some of us have practiced them more than others, or understand them and practice them more than others. What exactly we make of that is up to us, but it's something to consider. Are these the sorts of things that really only arise when we're actually on the Buddhist path, or are they the sorts of things that we all have in common, and they become bolstered in some way when we're on a path like we find in Buddhism that really works to strengthen them? It's something we'll have to consider for ourselves. I did a video actually about these 4 stages of progress, including the first one of becoming a stream enterer, and I'll put a link to that up on the screen. It might be interesting for you to take a look at it and try to understand, give us some viewpoint into this kind of question of what these are. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider joining us over on Patreon. I've got a link to the Patreon page down below. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.